Hey y'all, welcome to the third sidebar of season 5. Yes, I've been on a bit of a hiatus because duty calls, but I'm back. As usual, let's get a quick recap going. The last sidebar covered episodes 7 through 10. That's when Antonio officially met Peaches, even though their initial meeting was pretty brief. They met because he had a little run-in with the boss's goons, and Peaches stepped in to weigh the product. Antonio started to feel slighted by Brenda because he was taking most of the risk, but he wasn't getting any of the money. He moves in with the boss after having words with Brenda. He quickly found out that life there was uncomfortable. He decided to ask Brenda if he could come back, but he found that she had died from an overdose. And if that wasn't bad enough, Peaches let him know that the boss had orchestrated Brenda's murder to keep her from talking to his mom. Also, Peaches and Antonio left to do their own thing. And now, sidebar number 3. Before getting into this, I have to make a point. I was advised that there is a flaw in my logic, so I have to address it because I obviously dropped the ball. In episode 8, I gave a description of Antonio. The whole point was to present him as a bulky, solid guy. Not necessarily fat, but just heavy, because I like that kind of thing. Ooh. Anyway, I described him as being 6'2" and probably 200 pounds. My cousin, who's listening in real time, advised me that 6'2" and 200 pounds is actually quite small for a man. As a woman who's 4'11", yes, I'm 4'11", that sounded kind of heavy to me. Apparently, it is not. But because I needed him to look that way, we're just going to roll with it. Also, I can't take it back because the book has already been written. So, episode 11, playing the role. Picking up from where we left off, Antonio obviously decided to leave with Peaches. They had a good thing going for a minute. Peaches was an amazing homemaker. She cooked, cleaned, and she was a great asset to their drug business. They were 16 years old, so that was a lot. But when you think about it, that would have been a comfort zone for Antonio. He was raised in a pretty stable environment before he went to Brenda's. Having someone serve in a domestic capacity would probably have felt very normal to him. And just like she said she would, Peaches connected Antonio to all the right people. He really started to move up in the drug world. Not only that, but you start to see that Peaches had a real vision. Before they left the boss's place, Peaches told Antonio that she could make him look good. That wasn't just from a business perspective. Peaches could put things together, and she started picking out clothes for Antonio. From the outside looking in, they really looked like they had something solid. And Antonio was looking good, too. I guess they did have something solid for a while. But Antonio says that life got in the way. Sidebar. I want to point out something. This is the point where Antonio tells us why he called her Peaches. If you don't remember, her name was actually Kim. Antonio starts calling her Peaches because of the way her butt looked. Around the same time, she started calling him Bear because he was rough like a grizzly bear, but soft and sweet like a teddy bear. For transparency, that bear thing was a whole complete afterthought. I plugged that in when I was much farther into the storyline. I did that for a very specific reason. I wanted them to have something that was uniquely theirs because that felt like comfort. And I wanted Peaches to be that person for him. Think about growing up around your family. Most people get nicknames at an early age, and they stick with them, but most people outside don't share that connection with them. I wanted them to have that because they were so young when they met. Down the line, I wanted it to be something that only they shared because no one else was at that level of comfort. But back to the story. They were good for a minute, but life got in the way. But bigger than life is change. I think Antonio and Peaches were perfect examples of living a life that far exceeded where they should have been at the time. At 16, most people are experiencing puppy love, crushes, getting their first car, planning for prom. Antonio and Peaches were living like adults. She was basically being a housewife, and she had set Antonio up to be head of the household. And he was a boss. That was cool when they were 16 and doing something new, but the inevitability showed up. That's not really sustainable at that age. I mean, it happens, but boredom will most likely creep in, especially for a young guy. So, Antonio started cheating. For the record, I'm not excusing that. I'm just saying, 16 is not the age to lock down. There's so much exploring to do. And Peaches turned a blind eye to it. For the first time, Antonio was forced to think back to his mother. Remembering how his mother booted his father out, he understood that her respect took precedence over her comfort and their history. Because Peaches looked the other way, he saw her as someone that he could run over, and he did. Of course, the inevitable happened, and Antonio caught a charge. He was 21 years old. Shortly thereafter, he caught another one. Between the two charges, he served 3 years and some change, so he was about 25 when he officially came home. Peaches held everything down for both jail stints, and he always came home to a solid life. But after the second time, Antonio realized that Peaches had started to snort coke. He let it go because she seemed to have it under control. And in typical Peaches fashion, she had a plan. Episode 12, Cream. Peaches' plan came in the form of a business proposition. She introduced the idea of opening a strip club, and she came with a plan already lined up. Her rationale was, if the strip club was successful, they could go legit and keep Antonio out of jail. I know this is Antonio's story, but I feel like we're really getting a lot of exposure to how Peaches operates. When she came to Antonio about starting their own operation, she already had the details mapped out. She had the money, the connections, and a place set up for them to live. The same was true for the club. She already had the money and a plan. She just needed Antonio to get on board, and he did. They got a building, got the licenses, and hired staff. The only thing left was hiring strippers. I think it's important to note that Antonio is speaking from a position of insight after the fact. He's able to recognize that he didn't see the whole picture at the time. He was so impressed by how Peaches handled things that he didn't think about how she handled things. It makes sense when you realize it makes sense. Yeah, she always had the money to get things done, but he never took the time to think about how she had the money to get things done. In a direct quote, Antonio says, "A hard lesson that I had to learn was, you can't ever trust a person who has crossed someone else for their own advancement. That's predatory behavior. I hadn't learned that yet, so I didn't ask questions." Antonio knew that Peaches had stolen from the boss. Based on that, the educated Antonio wouldn't ever have trusted her. But because he wasn't that advanced in his thought processes at that time, he saw her ability to come through as a bonus. Anyway, Peaches was responsible for recruiting the strippers, but Antonio had to give the final okay. Enter Cream. I think it's pretty obvious that Cream didn't have the best of intentions. She came in to audition, but she flirted with Antonio right in front of Peaches. Not only did she not have the best of intentions, but she also didn't have the best speech. She said her name was Merkel, which ends up getting translated to miracle. Their story is originally from book 2 of the Keepsake box series. One of my favorite things in that book was the way Cream spoke. During the creation of the books, this podcast wasn't even on my list of things to do. So imagine when the podcast came about and I had to work my head around how I was going to talk like Cream. I thought it would be a huge undertaking, but I found that I like it. I don't sound like she sounded in my mind, but I'm not a voice actor, so y'all just got to roll with it. Cream was an amazing dancer, and she fit the business model. She was the hazelnut girl. Antonio specifically notes that he had no interest in sleeping with Cream, even though he found her attractive. Not only was he convinced that she wasn't his physical type, but Antonio also had some intent behind the way he moved. Allegedly. According to Antonio, and I quote, "I wasn't above cheating on Peaches, but when it came down to it, we're animals. And all animals compartmentalize. Most mammals have a den where they sleep and protect their young. They go outside of that den when they need to eat and use the bathroom. As humans, we do the same. We sleep in our bedrooms, eat in our dining areas, and expel waste in our bathrooms. I never had the intention to pee in my kitchen. In the short version, I cheated on Peaches, but I ain't never bring it home." Of course, Antonio would use an animal reference. But then he messed up. Episode 13, The Help. Antonio states that he didn't mess up right away. It took a few months. This is where Antonio explains the driving force behind how he made choices. In spite of the fact that he loved beautiful women, Antonio understood that they had to have something going on in their heads. He explained that at a later point in time. Cream didn't seem to fit that mold. He felt that she was a pretty girl that was probably a bit dense. It's at that point that Antonio reflects back to something that Peaches had told him years prior. She made him aware that his position would come with a slew of women who wanted to use him. But as a woman, Peaches didn't consider the male perspective. Antonio didn't think of it as being used. He had the financial means to look out for a few women without him sinking. And because he wanted to be entertained by them, he felt that it was basically an even trade. They both got what they wanted. But Antonio wanted to seek that out. The fact that Cream was obviously working that angle didn't appeal to him. But then, long story short, Peaches started to advance in her drug use, and it caused a rift between her and Antonio. Peaches wasn't really doing what was expected at work or with the businesses. Antonio asked her to go to rehab, and she said no. After an argument, Antonio goes to the club. Cream, being the observant person that she was, probably picked up on it. I'm saying that like I ain't write it, but what else? Like it wasn't set in stone. I feel like that's what happened. As a result, she knew it was a good time for her to swoop in. Cream came in that office and gave Antonio the business. After that, he was sold on her. Episode 14, Quid Pro Quo. Antonio and Cream were an official thing, so of course he ends up giving her a nickname. A part of this project's appeal is a time frame. Antonio met Cream in 1993. As a 44-year-old, I distinctly remember the era of the poetic justice braids, the intricate nail art, and the gaudy gold jewelry. That's basically the look that Cream had going on. But not to be underrepresented is the musical genius of that time. That same year, Wu-Tang Clan came out with a massive hit called Cream. It stood for Cash Rules Everything Around Me. Capitalizing on his love for that song, Antonio gives Miracle a nickname. It was Cream because Cash rules everything around her. She was so motivated by money, and Antonio saw that. But at the same time, he was getting what he wanted, so he wasn't bothered by it. It was a quid pro quo. A simple exchange, a favor for a favor. They were in a comfortable space because he didn't have the home life obligations that he had with Peaches. Inevitably, he got so caught up with Cream that he wasn't as bothered by the situation with Peaches, which I guess was the point. Things were going good for Antonio, but they ain't last long. Peaches caught him and Cream having sex in his office, like literally caught them in the act. The hilarious part about that comes in the form of recall, my personal recall. I don't know if this part landed for anybody else, but of course it did for me. Antonio explains how Peaches and Cream got into a fight and how his meat was slinging all around while he was trying to break it up. I don't know about you, but I distinctly remember Shalonda referencing his meat situation when they started to fall off. She basically said that the sex was only good because he was so catering. Yeah, let's go with that. But without that care being applied, the size was enough to ruin it. The size was enough to ruin it. And I believe her because why would she lie? But Antonio seemed to think that it was slinging all around, so we got to let him have it. Anyway, after he got caught, he started a series of lies. He told Peaches that he had ended things with Cream and fired her from the club. He didn't do either of those things. Instead, he paid her bills so she wasn't present at the club, but he was still involved with her. And with all that being the case, Antonio still insisted that they should both be faithful to him. According to Antonio, he covered all the things that they needed, so they didn't have a valid reason to need another man. Boy. Episode 15, Priorities. The episode opens with something that's pretty ominous. To quote, "When I think about it, I had the absolute worst luck. It wasn't just about the stuff that happened. It turned out that every misstep led to something that was even more consequential in the end. I can't touch on it right now because that would give it all away. But in the short version, every small thing opened the door for something bigger to happen. And even though I didn't see that at the time, all of those little things eventually added up to the one big thing. But that would all be much further down the line." Y'all gotta excuse me. It's like 6 o'clock in the morning and I'm sleepy. But anyway, I hope I remember to touch on that when the time comes. But long story short, Antonio was smoking weed in the car. Him and Peaches got pulled over and they found some weed. Unexpectedly, Peaches said it was hers. She explained that she would get a slap on the wrist because she had a clean record. But it turns out that the judge wanted to make an example out of her because he felt that she was covering for Antonio, which she was. Peaches was sentenced to 3 months. And while she was gone, Antonio realized how badly she had messed their money up. The slap in the face for him was the fact that he had always made their life together his first priority. But seeing that she had used their money for her own benefit was bothersome. Like he wasn't using their money on another woman behind her back. But anyway, That struck a chord with Antonio. And once he coupled that with the fact that Peaches was slacking otherwise, he lost a lot of respect for her. Antonio made sure that she was taken care of while he was locked up, but that was the extent of it. Meanwhile, he got closer to Cream. When he got closer to her, he realized that he needed to spend less money on her. He had to come back from what Peaches had messed up, so he told Cream to come back to work. Y'all know she ain't like that. I think it's important to note that Antonio was very self-aware, and I like that about him. To that point, his relationship with Cream was purely sexual. What allowed him to fall for her was his own self-awareness. Antonio understood that he was great at carrying out plans, but not necessarily that good with coming up with them. He was good with making money, but probably not the best with managing it. Up to that point, Peaches had ensured that things. But in her absence, he was able to see those same qualities in Cream. That's what allowed him to see her as more than just a pretty face and a body. Antonio didn't tell Cream that Peaches was locked up. He just said she was out of town. And being that she didn't want to go back to the club, Cream decided to capitalize off of Peaches' absence. She told Antonio that she had a plan. A lucrative one. The next episode is titled Upgrade, which will refer to a couple of different things. I'll let some more build up, then we'll catch up on the next Sidebar with Chinney.